Russia didn't expect this. Just before sunrise, the Baltic skies trembled under a deep metallic thunder. Dozens of American A-10 Warthogs, low, heavy, and unmistakably predatory, tore through the mist near the Kaliningrad frontier. Within seconds, radar screens from Poland to St. Petersburg lit up in frantic red. What was supposed to be a routine NATO flight suddenly looked like a message written in contrails aimed straight at Moscow's heart. At 5 a.m., the A-10s began their live-fire drills over training zones in Poland and Lithuania. Low-angle strafing runs, sharp banking turns, and mock missile launches simulated an assault on advancing armored columns from the east. NATO's public affairs unit streamed the operation in real-time professional footage, showcasing precision, coordination, and firepower. The message was unmistakable: America's air superiority remains unmatched, and NATO's unity is not a slogan, but a living force. Yet what made this spectacle chilling for Moscow was not what the Warthogs did, but where they did it. The targets were less than 100 kilometers from Kaliningrad's border, close enough for Russian observers to watch with the naked eye. To an untrained civilian, it looked like training. But to any military strategist, it looked like a rehearsal for war. Every maneuver, every coordinated turn was a message. Every puff of exhaust was part of a sentence written in the cold air above Eastern Europe. Military analysts across Europe agreed this was strategic communication at its most potent. To Russia, it said, "We can deploy air power to your doorstep anytime." To NATO allies, it promised, "You are not alone. If threatened, we respond together." And to the world, it reminded everyone that Washington still dictates the tempo of confrontation on the continent. By mid-morning, official statements tried to cool the fire. The Pentagon described it as a routine joint exercise. Poland's defense ministry called it a demonstration of deterrence. But behind closed doors, European intelligence briefings told a different story. This was a deliberate stress test of Moscow's reaction speed, coordination, and communication. It was chess with wings. Across the Baltic, civilians posted videos of the A-10s screaming overhead, massive gray beasts slicing through morning clouds, their cannons glinting in sunlight. Some people felt pride, others felt dread. For everyone, though, it was a reminder that the border between peace and chaos in Europe is thinner than ever. And as the thunder of the Warthogs faded into the horizon, one truth became clear: the message had been delivered, and it was written not in ink, but in jet fuel. But Russia would not stay silent for long. What came next would reveal just how far the Kremlin was willing to go to save face. By midday, the Kremlin could no longer pretend calm. Russian state television erupted with fury, calling the NATO flight a provocation, while officials rushed to announce emergency snap drills across the western military district. Convoys of S-400 launchers rolled through Kaliningrad's narrow highways. Iskander missile units were spotted redeploying toward the Baltic coast. On the surface, it looked like a show of strength. But to military observers, it was something else entirely: a defensive posture, a reaction born out of fear rather than confidence. Defense analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted the subtle difference. Immediately, Russia was bracing, not advancing. For a state obsessed with projecting power, that single distinction spoke louder than any speech from Moscow. The once feared bear was crouching, shielding itself behind its own borders, while NATO jets flew just beyond the invisible line. Every second of hesitation was another point scored by Washington's playbook of psychological dominance. Meanwhile, American and Allied aircraft maintained constant rotation. AWACS surveillance planes circled high above the Baltic, their radar domes scanning every blip of movement below. F-16 escorts shadowed the A-10s at medium altitude, ready to intervene at the first sign of Russian aggression. In coordinated intervals, KC-135 refuelers kept the sky alive with motion, ensuring the Warthogs could stay aloft for hours. The operation was seamless, a display of precision that mirrored America's doctrine of persistent presence. It wasn't training, it was a warning, a cold reminder that the United States still holds the power to shape the balance of fear over Europe. The roar of those engines echoed through the early dawn like a declaration, quiet to the ear but thunderous to every Russian command post watching the border. As reported by Defense News and Reuters, the formation moved with precision, not aggression, but the symbolism was unmistakable. When America's legendary tank killers appear this close to Russian soil, nothing about it feels ordinary. For Moscow, the situation presented an impossible dilemma. Vladimir Putin's generals knew that any reckless response could trigger NATO's Article 5, the collective defense clause that would turn a local skirmish into a continental war. Yet doing nothing would make Russia look weak before its own people. Inside the Kremlin's command chambers, the tension was palpable. Advisors urged restraint, propagandists demanded revenge, but no one had an answer for the fundamental question haunting every senior officer. How far can they push before someone crosses the line? In the Baltic skies, that line was growing thinner by the minute. U.S. pilots, many of them veterans of Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, flew with calm discipline, the kind that comes only from real combat. They knew what radar locks meant. They had heard the beeping of threat detectors before had seen missile trails rising through dust and smoke. Every maneuver they executed was part skill, part signal, reminding Moscow that these were not rookies testing new wings. These were battle-hardened aviators flying machines built for survival. One pilot, speaking later to Defense News under anonymity, recalled the eerie silence of that morning. "Below me was Poland," he said. Ahead was Russia, and every warning light was blinking. It wasn't a simulation anymore, it felt like history was waiting to repeat itself. The A-10s completed their maneuvers without firing a shot, yet the psychological damage was done. Across the Russian border, radar operators reported unknown low-level targets repeatedly skirting the defensive line, a constant reminder that America could touch the edge of Russia's airspace whenever it pleased. The world watched as the standoff hardened into a new normal, a shadow war fought with presence, pressure, and precision. But just as calm seemed to return, satellite images the next morning revealed something unexpected, something that would turn tension into full-blown alarm inside the Kremlin. At dawn the next day, satellites orbiting over Eastern Europe captured a development that changed everything. Fresh A-10 squadrons were landing at multiple air bases across Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. Fuel convoys snaked through highways, radar calibration trucks rolled into position, and NATO ground crews began expanding forward operating zones. Far from scaling down, Washington was doubling its presence. For Moscow's generals, this was the signal they dreaded. Phase 2 had begun. Inside, the Kremlin intelligence briefings grew darker by the hour. Reports described increased Western flight activity, electronic surveillance from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and heightened coordination between U.S. and European commands. What began as a single show of force was transforming into a sustained pressure campaign. Each flight, each movement of armor on Allied soil was calibrated not for war, but for influence, a slow tightening of the strategic noose around Russia's isolated enclave. The Pentagon's playbook was unfolding with mathematical precision. The first stage, low-level dominance, continuous deployments of A-10s at varying altitudes, maintaining a persistent presence to keep Russian radar crews on permanent alert. The second stage, fighter escort integration, bringing in F-16s and F-35s to shadow the Warthogs, creating multi-role deterrence formations capable of defense attack or suppression at a moment's notice. The third, joint NATO operations, coordinating across Polish, Lithuanian, and Latvian commands for seamless targeting drills and rapid logistics transfer. Every move served two purposes: collect intelligence and unsettle Moscow. High above the clouds, AWACS and RC-135 surveillance aircraft traced invisible circles mapping Russia's radar response patterns in real time. What took place was not a battle, but a game of nerves, and America was clearly setting the tempo. As one European official told BBC News, this is chess played with supersonic pieces. Every move tests not just Russia's defenses, but its leadership stability. Moscow's reaction came swiftly. Within 48 hours, S-400 batteries were repositioned along the Kaliningrad coast. Fighter jets began live-fire intercept drills. Russian media, echoing the Kremlin's fury, described NATO's actions as unprecedented Western aggression. Yet there was one undeniable fact: the A-10s never violated Russian airspace. Every mission, every turn stayed just within international boundaries. It was psychological warfare at its purest, close enough to provoke, never enough to justify retaliation. The A-10 Thunderbolt, the SKU, nicknamed the Warthog, is not just another aircraft. Born from the paranoia of the Cold War, it was designed for one purpose: to annihilate Soviet armor. Its heart is the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon capable of firing nearly 4,000 depleted uranium shells every minute, each round slicing through tank armor like paper. This machine was built for one kind of battlefield, a European one littered with steel and smoke. And now, decades later, it had returned to the very frontier it was designed to defend. For Russia's generals, it was maddening. They were being forced to dance to a rhythm they didn't control. Every time they reacted, NATO documented the response, analyzed the data, and adjusted its tactics. In Washington's eyes, it was scientific calibration, understanding how far they could push before the Kremlin broke. In Moscow's view, it was encirclement, humiliation, and a threat wrapped in precision. The Kremlin's propaganda machine tried to counterattack with televised images of Tu-22 bombers flying near NATO airspace, but analysts noticed the pattern: Russia was reacting, not leading. That single dynamic shift revealed a deeper truth of modern warfare: control isn't measured by territory anymore, but by tempo. And right now, America controlled every beat of the Baltic sky. Still, one critical question lingered inside the Pentagon and the Kremlin alike. How long could this dangerous game continue before one wrong signal turned deterrence into disaster? By the third day, the situation had evolved into something far more calculated than a mere show of force. The Pentagon strategy, quietly briefed to NATO commanders, had entered its most delicate stage: dynamic deterrence. The A-10s would now operate in rotating flights, maintaining constant visibility without overt aggression, a living signal that America could hold the skies indefinitely. Every flight path, every radio frequency, every refueling maneuver was deliberate, sending a message that Washington understood exactly how to sustain pressure without crossing the line into open conflict. From Brussels to Warsaw, analysts described it as a masterclass in escalation control. NATO wasn't testing weapons, it was testing patience. The U.S. Air Force's doctrine was simple but devastating: make Russia react to every move, forcing its command chain to exhaust itself, chasing ghosts across the radar grid. As Deutsche Welle reported, Western surveillance aircraft were now mapping Russia's signal responses in real time, turning the skies into a laboratory of electronic warfare. Inside Kaliningrad, Russian officers faced an agonizing paradox. Each time their radars lit up, it revealed valuable data to NATO. Each time they stayed silent, it allowed the Americans to operate freely. Even as state television blared defiance, the Kremlin's generals were trapped in a situation they couldn't control, reacting to shadows while the real game played out hundreds of miles away in Washington's planning rooms. At the same time, AWACS and RC-135 reconnaissance planes continued circling overhead, quietly listening to every radar ping, every encrypted transmission. American cyber units stationed in Germany intercepted frequency shifts and jamming attempts, cataloging them for future use. It wasn't open warfare, it was invisible dominance, an operation designed to measure, map, and manipulate the opponent's defensive rhythm. For the A-10 pilots themselves, the tension was constant but controlled. These were not rookies, they were combat veterans. They had flown over Baghdad under anti-air fire, over Syria through missile traps, over Afghanistan's mountains at night. To them, this was another battlefield, just quieter, colder, and infinitely more dangerous because the enemy was watching but not shooting. One pilot later told Defense News, "You could feel the standoff in your bones. We were close enough to see the Russian coastline glint in the morning sun, but far enough that one wrong turn would light the world on fire." Each hour in the air tightened the psychological vice around Russia's military establishment. The Kremlin's public statements grew angrier, more desperate. But behind those words, the internal memos painted a darker picture. Commanders reporting fatigue radar operators stretched to the limit and units burning through resources simply to track NATO's relentless movements. Washington's quiet storm, as some called it, was working exactly as intended. The Cold War had once been fought with walls and tanks. Now it was fought with data distance and nerves. And while Moscow's missiles sat silent, America's message was already loud enough to echo through every briefing room of the Russian Defense Ministry: "We are closer than you think, and we decide when to stop." Inside hangars across Germany and Poland, mechanics worked through the night. Under harsh floodlights, crews armed the A-10s, not with blanks, but with live munitions. AGM-65, Maverick missiles, laser-guided JDAM bombs, and belts of freshly loaded Avenger shells. The pilots studied maps of the Baltic corridor, reviewing Kaliningrad's air defense rings, memorizing every radar blind spot and every approach angle. By 3 a.m., the engines were already growling, the air shimmering with heat and tension. Anyone monitoring satellite feeds could tell this was not another NATO drill. Something was about to happen. But even as the skies calmed over the Baltic, a new phase was already forming on the horizon, one that would push this silent confrontation closer to the edge than ever before. By the end of the week, the Baltic skies grew quiet again, too quiet. The A-10 Warthogs had returned to base, their missions completed without a single shot fired. Yet for everyone watching from Moscow to Washington, it was clear that this was not the end, merely an intermission. The message had been delivered, the data collected, and the psychological pressure firmly established. Russia had been forced to witness in real time the unmatched coordination of the U.S. Air Force and NATO allies, a choreography of dominance carried out without a single violation of international law. Inside, the Kremlin debriefings turned into debates. Intelligence officers analyzed every radar trace, every flight pattern, trying to determine Washington's next step. Some advisors urged an asymmetric response, cyber operations, naval posturing, or long-range bomber patrols. Others warned that any escalation could ignite something far worse. For Vladimir Putin, it was a no-win scenario. Responding militarily would risk a war Russia could not sustain. Remaining silent would expose weakness. It was the same dilemma that haunted Soviet leaders decades ago, only now America's technology had turned that old Cold War fear into a real-time digital humiliation. Across NATO bases, however, the tone was confident. Commanders praised the operation's precision. No accidents, no airspace breaches, and yet the Kremlin had mobilized an entire district in panic. In military terms, it was a perfect execution deterrence achieved through discipline. For the United States, the flight of the Warthogs had become more than a test. It was a demonstration of resilience, coordination, and readiness. Each sortie had reminded Europe that Washington's shield still extends across its skies. And for the pilots, the mission carried a deeper meaning. Many of them grew up in a world where the A-10 was a legend of the past, a Cold War relic bound for retirement. But as one officer remarked, that aircraft was built to stop the Soviets. Decades later, it's still doing its job. The titanium beast had returned to the frontier it was born to defend, and once again it had done so without flinching. By nightfall, the radar screens dimmed, the tension eased, and the region slipped back into uneasy silence. Yet everyone in Moscow, Warsaw, and Washington knew the truth: the calm wouldn't last. Because when American Warthogs roar near Kaliningrad, the echo lingers. It tells every rival power that the United States can project strength not just with missiles or words, but with presence cold, calculated, and unforgettable. History may remember this as the night when the Cold War's ghost briefly came alive again and when Washington reminded the world that power isn't always about firing first. Sometimes it's about flying close enough to make the other side blink. The Kaliningrad standoff wasn't just another military exercise, it was a message written in jet fuel and precision. It showed how 21st century warfare is no longer fought with bullets, but with strategy, timing, and fear. For decades, the A-10 Warthog symbolized America's promise to defend Europe against the steel tide of the Soviet Union. And now, in a world reshaped by new threats, it is proven that the old promise still stands. While Russia scrambled defenses, the United States demonstrated control not through violence, but through calculated dominance. Every maneuver, every roar of those engines reminded the world that deterrence is an art form, mastered only by those who understand restraint. The operation near Kaliningrad became a masterclass in modern strategy without provoking pressure, without pushing wind, without war. It is moments like these that define superpowers. Strength is not about who strikes first, but who controls the tempo of the storm. And in this game of shadows and signals, America once again showed that it leads not by fear, but by precision. At precisely 4:15 a.m., the first wave of Warthogs lifted from Poland's Lask air base. Overhead, AWACS surveillance aircraft began their wide orbit while refueling tankers traced invisible loops across the Baltic sky. The formation stayed barely 300 feet above the ground, hugging terrain to avoid early radar detection. For Russian commanders, the alert came too late. Warning lights flared across control centers, and within minutes, fighters from Chkalovsk Air Base were scrambled. Ground crews raced to ready S-400 batteries. Across the region, the same thought spread through every bunker and control room. Is this a strike or something worse? Do you believe this balance of power will hold, or are we standing on the edge of a new Cold War? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more breaking analyses of the world's most dangerous standoffs. The Cold War's ghost had returned not as a memory, but as a sound. The low growl of American engines closing in from the west. And as those A-10s turned north toward Kaliningrad, the question that kept every Russian officer awake was no longer, why are they here? But what comes next? The answer and Moscow's reaction would shake the region before sunrise. Inside Kaliningrad's underground command bunker, the tension was suffocating. Russian officers stared at their radar screens in disbelief. More than 24 American attack aircraft were approaching in tight tactical formations, typically used for anti-armor missions. The sound of overlapping alarms filled the room. One officer whispered, "Is this an exercise or a strike?" No one dared to answer. Outside, S-400 missile crews scrambled to combat positions while MiG and Su-series fighters roared off runways in desperate response. It was not just a drill anymore, it felt like the opening frame of a nightmare Moscow had spent decades preparing to avoid. By dawn, Russian state media began reporting unidentified aircraft near the border. Within minutes, the Ministry of Defense confirmed intensive NATO air activity across the Baltic. What the Kremlin feared most was unfolding in real time. American aircraft testing Russia's response time over its most fortified region. The psychological blow was immense. As Reuters later noted, Kaliningrad is Russia's forward fortress, a heavily armed enclave shielded by layered air defenses and missile systems. To see U.S. warplanes maneuvering within visual range was not just humiliation, it was exposure.